Hello.
We're invisible.
We are invisible. We are here. We are here. Hang on. I don't know why this is.
I don't know about you, Colin, but I'm feeling very blue today.
Yeah. Why is that looking like that?
There we go.
Here we go.
Now I'm feeling sort of dark, but that's okay.
Right. Yes.
Perfect.
So, there we go. That's what I was trying to getting confused between the background and the overlay. Anyway, hello and welcome to the English Language Club. It's time for our weekly hangout. I'm Colin, and this is Tony. Tony, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm glad to be here, Colin.
Great. Yeah, we've got a couple of people watching already. Matthias and AJ is watching.
Welcome.
So, yeah, I think there's a few more people watching as well. So if you have just joined us, please do say hi and get your questions coming in, because we do need your questions to have something to talk about. We've got a good question from AJ, and I think we got one from last week.
Yeah.
Should we start with AJ's question and then go to the one from last week?
Sure, let's do it.
So let's see if I can bring that up. Here we are. AJ says, what is your best video for someone who's looking to move from Google Translate to actually being able to speak English?
Well,
that's
a hard process.
Yeah. I mean, Google Translate is a useful thing. There's nothing wrong with using it. And it's not like, I mean, that transition, that move away from using tools like that, using a dictionary or whatever, Google Translate, is a very long and slow one, right?
Yeah.
I mean, people.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, and native speakers are always using dictionaries and things as well. It's something.
In fact, it's one of those things. Yeah, like using a tool like a translation tool, or a dictionary or anything like that. It's somewhat going to depend on what your strengths and weaknesses are. But there isn't really a movement from using a tool to not using the tools. Like you said, maybe you will use them less, right? Like you will less frequently have to look up what is the translation of your language into the language you're learning. But again, even if you speak English completely fluently, you're going to have to look up some words sometimes. If nothing else, maybe it has an additional meaning that you didn't know, right? So really, this is just the question: how do you go from not being able to speak English at all and only being able to use Google Translate to being able to speak some English? And that the thing about that is, I don't think you can really speak English through Google Translate. Like if you translate it and then you try to say what Google Translate says, you're probably not going to come out as very intelligible.
I mean, Google Translate does have the kind of speech thing, so you can talk into it on your phone and then have it play back. But I've never really done that as a.
Me neither.
To
actually use it, only to use to figure out the pronunciation of a word, right?
Yeah. I mean, I might talk into it because it's quicker than typing, but I only to sort of figure out what I'm trying to say, and then I say it.
So what are the kind of the first steps that you take when you want to be able to understand how English works as a language and be able to come up with your own sentences without translating it from your language, either using Google Translate or even your mind, thinking of a sentence first in your own language and then translating it into English? How do you change from being able to think of sentences in English? That might be another way to look at this question.
Yeah.
Right. That's tough. To me, the first thing that I think is really important is really, really kind of understanding the structure of sentences so that you're used to saying a sentence in an English way, so that you immediately start thinking in terms of subject, auxiliary verb, main verb, and then completer, object or predicate or whatever.
And then how to use how to make a negative sentence using the word not in the correct place. But not just not, it's auxiliary verb not. So I do not, and then the contractions. So I don't, I am, or I'm not. This is all things that are very different in English to other languages. So, and you may, if you know of any English speakers who speak your language as a second language, you may be able to learn things from the mistakes that they make.
That's true.
So, if you sort of literally translate how they would say it, then you might, then you end up with the correct grammar in English.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah,
that's a good point. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, but then I think that most of the time, if you've learned English in a classroom, then that will have involved some level of speaking from the beginning. I suppose there may be people who've only learned English through watching movies and TV shows and music, and then reading things on the internet and things like that, and have never actually spoken.
Mm-hmm. It's a common thing I find myself in, where I can read a language fairly well, but I've never really spoken it very much. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I guess that's. I mean, yeah, it's just practice. You just have to. There's no easy answer to a lot of these to questions like this. You just need to practice. Open your mouth, make mistakes, speak. Try to be understood. If you're not understood, try to figure out what mistakes you're making. I mean, but Google's a good tool for figuring out what mistakes you're making, or it's just practice. I mean, and that's why we're here. That's what we're trying to help with. If people hear phrases that they don't understand, then we can help explain that. It's just practice, I suppose. But anyway, we've got a lot more people joining us.
Yes. Hello to Shanoza and Osama. Alaikum assalam, Faraz. Hi to Dave and Roman. And I guess we should say hello to Francisco Nagua, Matthias's teacher.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Hello, Francisco. Hope you're doing well. Hope Matthias is a good student. I think he must be, because he's here watching us on at the English Language Club. So yeah, if you do, thank you all for saying hello. And if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat. Have we got any questions, or we just got people saying hello? I don't think we do.
Some comments. Dave says he has a heavy accent when speaking English. Dave's from Asia. That's a big place. What part of Asia? But that's an issue that we get a lot, right? People, we talk a lot about accent.
Yeah.
And is having a heavy accent bad? Right? And we strongly believe that having a heavy accent isn't bad, as long as people can understand you. Right? If your pronunciation of the sounds is good, that people can understand what sounds you're making, and they can understand what words you're saying, then having a heavy accent isn't bad.
So but there's a difference between accent and pronunciation, and it's okay to have an accent. I don't like this term, reduce my accent, because everyone has an accent. I have an accent. Tony has an accent. You can't reduce your accent. It's not something that is quantifiable.
There's no zero. There's no zero, right? You can't get closer to zero. You can change your accent from being more of to more British or more American, more Indian. Dave said he's from Hong Kong. I was in Hong Kong for a bit. couple of years ago and loved it. It was fantastic. So you would definitely be able to find people in Hong Kong who speak English either as a first language or not, and ask them, I know my accent is strong, but can you understand my words, right? Or do I need to work on the pronunciation of certain sounds so that you can understand those words that I'm saying? Because really, that's what's important. The point of being able to speak another language is to communicate. If you can't be understood, then that's a barrier to communication. But if you can be understood, then your accent isn't a barrier, right?
Yes. So what we're getting at is what we need to do is try to improve our pronunciation, that rather than reduce our accent.
Yes.
So yeah, and if you want to improve your pronunciation, I would say try to figure out what sounds you're making mistakes with.
What specific sounds? Yes.
Specific sounds. Because when we break English down, it breaks down into 44 different sounds. And each one of those sounds is made in a physical way. Pronunciation is physical, and therefore any mistake in pronunciation is a physical thing. So don't just think, oh, I can't say that sound. It's like you think, what am I not doing with my lips or my tongue or my teeth?
Right.
For an example of a sound that a lot of people get wrong is the th or th, and it's because they're not sticking their tongue out. Like you'll see when I made that, the sound is made by blowing air between the teeth, the top teeth, and the tongue. But a lot of people they're not accustomed to pushing their tongue out like that, so they try and do it without doing that. So it comes out like a d, d. This is why you hear people say "d" instead of "the." They're trying to say the word "the," but it comes out as "d."
Mm-hmm.
So it's all physical. So if you just figure out what are those physical things that you're not doing or that you are doing wrong on specific sounds,
right? Yeah. Figure out how to say it correctly, and then practice. It's just like exercising any other muscle. Another example would be the difference between the ul sound, an L, and the sound in an R, right? If you're just listening to it, it might be really hard to tell the difference. But if you look, for instance, at the really good videos that Colin has made about the pronunciation of each sound, right, then you can see, well, it's about where you put your tongue, right? The ul, the L sound, you put your tongue like on that little ridge behind your teeth, right? Ul. So you put your tongue close to behind your teeth. The right there. Yeah. The R sound, you're putting your tongue, kind of curling it up in the middle of your mouth, further back, right? Yeah. And depending, sometimes you might touch it to the top of your mouth or not, right? And so once you know that, like that difference, practice that. Practice putting your tongue in that position to say ul and ul and Figure out the physical thing that you're doing wrong, and then practice that, because that is what is going to make you make you easier to understand and help other people understand your speech, right? That's what's important. When we think of accent reduction, we think of a lot of things, but really figure out what sounds you have a hard time with, right? Ask someone who speaks English, am I saying this word right? Okay, what sound am I saying wrong? Then find out what sound that is in IPA, watch the video that Colin has on that sound, figure out exactly what to do with your tongue, your lips, your vocal cords, and then practice, right?
Yeah. And Dave does say, I always look up IPA, which is great, because that is the system of breaking the language down, the spoken language down into those different sounds. And then, in my videos on each sound, we sort of break down each sound into the physical elements of how it's made. Yes. Now, I'm really happy Roman has commented here. He says, remember that the key to pronunciation is physical.
It's physical. One of our favorite sayings.
Well, exactly. I'm so happy to hear somebody say that, because it means that it's what we're saying is sinking in, which is good. So thank you, Roman, and welcome.
Yes. And as Dave says, practice makes perfect. And as Haroon says, just practice, practice, practice. Yes. It's just like exercising. You're not going to become an amazing footballer without practicing. You're not going to improve the way you say sounds, your pronunciation, without practicing.
Yeah.
Great. So we also have a good question from Roman early up. Is that the first
in grammar
question we have, I think?
Yeah, just also quickly hello to Haroon before we get started on that question. And Susanta's here.
And Susanta, welcome back.
Lots of questions from Susanta coming up. But yes, this question from Roman first of all. So in grammar, how can you tell what speech acts take place in a given type of sentence? Declarative or imperative?
So how can you tell whether a sentence is a declarative sentence, an imperative sentence, or an interrogative sentence, a question? Basically, is a sentence a statement, a command, or a question? And that is a really good question because on one level there's a very easy answer, but also that can get very complicated sometimes, especially telling the difference. Sometimes a command or a question doesn't look like a command or a question. You have to pay more attention. The first obvious one is that a question has a question mark at the end of it.
When you're writing.
When you write it, right? And an imperative sentence sometimes has an exclamation point, right? So if it's written in a book or something like that, that's a good clue. Spoken, it's a little bit different. Like the way we say commands, you can usually tell by the way someone says it. Go turn out the light. There's just a certain forceful quality to it, right? Same with a question. We either raise the tone of our voice or lower the tone of our voice. So, did you get milk? Or where do you want to go today?
Now, in other languages, like in Spanish, for example, that's the only thing that makes it a question, right? Is that tonal, that tone change. So I think in some ways, on one level, in English is easier because there are more grammatical differences,
right,
between questions and declarations,
but not always.
Right? Well, exactly. Because you could say when we follow the rules, there are. Yeah.
Right. You could say you bought milk. That's a question. Right.
Yeah.
But there would be no grammar clues to that. Right. And that's why I say, like, if you go back to the beginning, though, like grammatically, how do you tell the difference? Well, this is one of our three big ideas, really, is the difference between a positive sentence, which is declarative, a negative sentence, which is also declarative, and a question structure. Right. And the main clue there is that you switch the subject and the auxiliary verb. Right. And often there's a question word, who or what, but not always. Yeah. Right.
But the important thing is the auxiliary verb will still come first before the main verb, or before the subject in a question, whereas in a statement, the subject will come first.
Right. Yes.
When we're following the rules.
And only for, again, not every question is going to fit that. Right? Did you just arrive? Will, right? Yeah. Because instead of saying I did just arrive, you would say did you, right? So or you just arrived. You would add that auxiliary verb do and move it to before. Did you just arrive instead of you did just arrive, right? That's the main clue for a question or an interrogative sentence.
Yeah, but there are other types of question.
There are.
You just want to add, but carry on. We'll get to those later.
Go ahead with the.
Okay. So then you could also. It gets confusing because although that's kind of the main way to identify a question, another way to make a question is what we call a question tag, which is when you make a declarative statement, and then you add the auxiliary verb and subject at the end. So you just arrived, did you? You went shopping, did you? You know that. So it's kind of there isn't really a rule about when we make a. I guess those questions are more rhetorical, like you know the answer already, but you're just sort of maybe surprised and you want
primarily they're going to be used for yes or no questions, right? You don't say you did what? I mean, that's another kind. It's not the same as a question tag, but if with a question tag, like you went to the store, right? Or you went to the store, didn't you? That's going to be a yes or no question. You can also do that with a question word, but you don't tag it onto the end. You just kind of make it the object. Like he talked to who? And that's not
really a question. Common. You don't want an answer. It's like,
well, no, you might
a way of expressing surprise.
Yeah. Most of the time. Well, I don't even know if most of the time. That's one common thing that you use that sort of sentence for. But so if there's a question word, who, what, when, where, that's a good clue. The switching of the auxiliary verb and the subject is the best clue for a question, right?
Yeah.
Most questions are going to have that. The auxiliary verb is going to come before the subject instead of after the subject, right? But like I said, there's lots of other types of questions. Just a question that you just say it, but you ask it like a question, right? You just got here, or question tags or rhetorical questions and things like that. So at the very basic, it's usually easy. Just like when you're writing, there's probably going to be a question mark. But then there can be more complicated ones. The frustrating one is imperative. There are some signals to the imperative. The best one is that you drop off the subject entirely, right? We don't say, you turn off the lights. We just say, turn off the lights. Or if we do say someone's name, we if you were writing it out, you would put a comma. So I'd say, Colin, wait for me, or whatever. But you don't really say a subject. And that's the best clue for an imperative sentence, is that usually the subject is you, but you don't say it.
The person being talked to.
The person you're talking to. Yeah. So wait for me. Hold on. Close the door. Again, no subjects. No subject is the best clue for an imperative sentence, but it's not always going to be the case because imperative is not actually one kind of sentence. It's a whole bunch of kinds of sentences that include commands, requests, all sorts of things.
And also, if you do that form of imperative, it's very direct. Shut the door. Tell me the time. It's like it can sound like you're angry or something. So,
and we talk about this a lot. That in English we tend to be very indirect when we're being polite, rather than direct.
We want to be polite. Yeah. So we might say, "Can you tell me the time?"
Or would you mind telling me the time?
Yeah. Right? So that's a question. But really, it's an imperative, which is weird and confusing, I suppose.
So I don't know, Roman, if you knew that your question was as big and as interesting a question as it was. To just recap very shortly, the main grammatical clue for a question is you switch the order of the subject and the auxiliary verb. And if there wasn't an auxiliary verb, you have to put it there. So instead of you did arrive early, did you arrive early? Auxiliary verb comes before the subject. The main clue for an imperative sentence is that the subject is just left off, right?
Yeah.
Hand me the papers, right? Instead of you hand me the papers, right? So that's the simple answer. But the reality is that these are very, very complicated things because this is not really a language thing, kinds of sentences. Really, it's just a thing where we are trying to create groupings, but really a declarative sentence is actually a whole bunch of different types that are all sort of similar. An imperative is a whole bunch of different types that are sort of similar, and same for questions, right? Roman's follow-up question is that the syntactic form might be different from the actual the speech act, and you're right. Right? Can you pass me the salt? Syntactically is an imperative. It's a request, but grammatically, it looks like it's a so syntactically it's written as a question, right? I'm actually asking you. Semantically, it's a request. Syntactically, it is a question. So you're right. You're absolutely right. Sometimes the syntactic and semantic forms are different. Again, I don't really like to use the terminology there. So what I mean is that what Roman is talking about is the form of the sentence might be different from how it's being used. So if I ask, "Can you pass me the salt?" how it's being used is as an imperative. It's a request. But the form of the sentence is a question, right? So sometimes our form and our meaning aren't always exactly the same. And that's true in any language. English is just more free to kind of be itself and do whatever.
I think it's definitely, certainly the three types of sentence, positive, negative, and question, is a big part of the first section of our course.
Yes.
Inside English, which focuses on the tenses. But I think we're only halfway through writing the course, really. And I think later lessons will definitely have to do
more question types, more imperatives.
Well, definitely more question types, but then also imperatives. And then when we break these rules and how intonation comes into it and things like that, it's one of those things that gets more and more complicated to the point where it's not worth thinking about.
It's something you just kind of get used to.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So great question, Roman.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So Suzanne's got a few questions.
All right. Always exciting.
So the first one is, what does unraveling of indoctrination mean?
Oh, okay. So I don't know. Unraveling is maybe not the most common word you would use here, but there are a lot of different words you could use. Undoing the indoctrination, reversing the indoctrination.
So what does indoctrination mean?
Indoctrination is where some outside force changes the way you think by teaching or by lots of different techniques, including, I don't know, lots of things. Sometimes we call this brainwashing too.
It's an interesting word because from a kind of word structure point of view, the kind of base word there is doctrine, which is like a way of thinking, right? Or
what you believe, right? What you believe is true. Yeah.
Well, is it though, or is it what someone believes is something that someone can believe is true, but not necessarily that you believe?
No, well, I mean, your doctrine is what you believe, right?
Yeah, exactly.
A doctrine is a belief, right?
Yeah.
It may be your belief, it may be someone else's belief, right?
Yeah. Right. So then that can be made into a verb by saying indoctrinate, which means
to make someone a doctrine on. So you're forcing someone to believe something is what indoctrination means. Now, force might be really force,
to indoctrinate,
or it might be
that's the verb. Would be the verb,
yeah. To indoctrinate, right? It means you might be forcing, like as in really using force, or it might just be over time teaching and convincing someone. So indoctrination is not always 100% bad, but it can be, right? And so an indoctrination is where you've changed someone to believe in a certain thing, right? Or believe a certain way. So that's not always a positive. A lot of times we see people who have been indoctrinated into something negative. They've been turned into, they've been taught to believe hateful things, racism or violence, or things like this. And so we often want to look, how do we unindoctrinate someone? How do we fix that if they've been taught or forced to believe things that are wrong or harmful, or sometimes just that we disagree with? And so there's a lot of words we use for that. Undoing the indoctrination, reversing the indoctrination, unraveling. right? Unravel means to take something that's woven together and pick it apart piece by piece until it's not together anymore. Yeah. Like pulling one string out of a piece of cloth until the entire piece of cloth is gone.
It's right? A common metaphor.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. But undoctrination is not a word.
Unindoctrinate is not a word, right? So we have to come up with something else. Unravel. I mean, the way English works is you could say unindoctrinate and everyone would know what you mean, right? But it's not really a word. We use other words for that.
Yeah. But indoctrination aside, I was just pointing out that it is an interesting word because it has this you can see the root word and the different forms that it has. So you could take a word like a verb like to inhabit, to live on. This house is inhabited. And you could do the same thing. So you inhabitation or habitation is like a noun form of inhabit, and then you could say uninhabited. So it's interesting the word, that sort of word formation and the rules there are for turning a verb into a noun, and then different ways to make it negative and things like that. So I just thought that was an interesting word.
Yes, for sure.
Okay, so another one from Suzanne Sir. What does relatively speaking mean?
What an interesting phrase there. Yes. So something is relative. We talked about this earlier. A really good example for what relative is like accent. Something is relative if there's no zero. There's no baseline that you can compare everyone to, right? Like height isn't relative. Everyone is you measure their distance from the ground, right? The ground is zero, right? So everyone is everything is you can compare to the set amount. If you're talking about things relatively, means you're not talking about something at its with a baseline that a zero that you can measure from. So sometimes certain things are just always relative, right? People talk about time is relative, space is relative, whatever. But when you want to say, I realize that there's a baseline, there's a zero we can all compare to, but I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about that. So if you say to everyone, you say, relatively speaking, you say that you're not talking about comparing it to some universal baseline, but just you're talking about it compared to each other. So you can say, if you live in a place where there's a lot of short people and one person is a little bit taller, he or she might still be below average height for the world, but relatively speaking, he might be very tall, right? If you're in a place with a lot of short people, then even someone who's average height might be tall, relatively speaking, right?
So even a small teacher, of a school teacher, might be relatively tall in the classroom, but when they leave the classroom, they're short.
Exactly, right? A short person teaching a bunch of kids, exactly, would be relatively tall, even if they're a short person, right? So we use this for a lot of things. So you say, we might be talking about universities or let's say you're talking about Oxford and Cambridge University. They're both some of the best universities in the world. But if you ask, if someone asks you, which is better, Oxford or Cambridge? Well, they're both better than almost any other school you could go to. But if you ignore that and you say, well, relatively speaking, which one is better, right? Then you're not talking about everything. You're just talking about compared to each other, right?
So it's in the winter, it's like the phrase narrows in the context.
Yes.
Of what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yes. And Jack said the opposite of relative is absolute, and that is correct. Yeah. So but we don't say absolutely speaking. We say in absolute terms, right? So for instance, in the winter, you might say, well, it's hot. It's relatively hot, right? Because it's not as hot as it would be in the summer. So you might say, in absolute terms, it's cold. Maybe it's in the winter, but it's like 15 degrees. You say, oh, well, it's relatively hot compared to the time around, right? But in absolute terms, I know it's not actually hot, right?
Okay, great. So we got a few more. One more question, I think, from Susanna so far. But before we do that, just a quick say hi to Jeff. Jeff says hi, and to hi Jeff, and Ahmed. Hello to you. And we've just got a really long comment coming from Zahira on Facebook.
So hello, Zahira. Always good to hear from you.
That's a very long question. I haven't read it yet, but we will get to that. I'm not sure if it will all fit on the screen though.
I had to break it into chunks or something.
Yeah. So one more question from Susanna. Now I've lost it. What was it?
He is a political insider.
Yes, that's the one. Political insider.
So a political insider turned outsider. Now, here it doesn't really matter whether you're talking about politics or not. An insider is someone who has been in something for a long time. They know its secrets. They know how it works, right? Mm-hmm. So a business insider is someone who has been in that business and they know it. A political insider is someone who has been in politics and they know it, right? So an outsider is someone who doesn't know it, or at least seems like they're on the outside. So when someone who's never been in politics before runs for politics, they say, "Oh, he's an outsider. He doesn't know all he doesn't know everybody. He doesn't do things the same way. He's going to do things differently." So sometimes someone who is actually an insider pretends to be an outsider as part of their reputation, and that's what this phrase means.
Now, we know that from Suzanne, because she's a very regular poster of questions. She's often reading the news and seeing phrases and asking what they mean. Now, I think I know the story that Susanna has been reading this week. There's a former political insider in the UK called Dominic Cummings. He used to be an advisor to the Prime Minister, but they had a falling out, and he's recently been kind of spilling the beans, which means telling the story of what telling his side of the story of some of the controversies that the Prime Minister and they went through during the pandemic and things. So is that right, Susanna? Was it the story to do with Dominic Cummings that you've that's where you saw that phrase?
Probably so.
Yeah. So yeah, he's a political insider turned outsider.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So let's see.
We had a question from Gabrielle, which has become a series. This is a mini series talking about the very important state of being verbs.
Yeah. We've had this the last couple of weeks. We've touched on it.
We started with get, and then we did have, and now we're going to do become. So his next week is or be. So to recap for those of you who are joining us this week, but not the last couple of weeks. A few weeks ago, we talked about how there's 4 words in the English language that all have to do with your status or describing you or whatever. They're basically be and have. Some things we describe a person as being, some things we describe a person as having, right? Like I might say, I am tall, but I have a beard, right? You could say I am bearded, but that's not the way we would normally say it in English. We say, he has long hair, or I have brown eyes, right? So there's not that doesn't really have has to do with possessing, but I could also say, I have height, but that's just not the way we normally say it in English. In other languages, it's going to be a little different. Like in English, we say, I am 75 years old, or he is 75 years old. But in, say, Spanish, you would say, he has 75 years, or in French or whatever, right? So we talked about what these different ones mean. And, but then, so there's be and have, but then there's also the version of those where it's changing. And that's become and get, right? So become it's a status word. It tells you what you are, though again, it's very close to have. But become means that something is changing about it, right? He became older is another, you wouldn't normally say it that way. You'd say he grew up, right? Or things like this, right? So become is the changing version of be. Though, so you might say he became angry, right? Or it was becoming dark. The thing about become is, in more informal contexts, we usually use get, right? He's getting older. It's getting dark, right? It's I'm getting hungry, right? He's getting angry, right? And that's because, again, be and have, they sort of seem like they're a little different, but the reality is they're very, very similar in ways you describe things. Same is true for become and get. They're both, talking about a status or a description, but how it's changing.
Yeah.
Right.
Is there a word for that type of verb, like a transitive or something?
I literally was thinking about it a few minutes ago and trying to decide if we were going to use it. Now the word is gone from my head. Yes, there is a word for it, but different places will call it different things, right? It's a stative verb, but it's a state of changing. I can't remember what the word is. It just skipped out of my head, but there is a word for it. But again, different textbooks or whatever will call it something a little different. Gabriella is saying become as to come to be. Exactly.
That's a good, great way to
change into being, literally. Yeah. Exactly.
Great. Okay.
Good question.
So we've got a couple of questions from Jack, and then this one from Tahira on Facebook. So here's the first one. Jack says, in entomological
would be studying insects. Etymological is studying the history of words.
Oh, yes, etymological inquiry. Are there any practices to keep in mind when tracing the origin of a word back to its roots?
So the question is, like, if you're trying to figure out where did a word come from, I do this a lot. I will mention, this word comes from, its history or whatever. The first thing to do.
This ties in with what I was saying earlier about word formation a little bit, because you get the sort of, you get the kind of Greek prefixes and suffixes and
Yes. So sometimes you can just look at a word and pick it apart into its pieces, right? If you're talking about practices, the thing that you need to do is don't assume just because it looks like a suffix or a root that it is. There are plenty of words out there where the etymology is not anything like what you would think. An example I always give is the word ginger in English, like the spice, means two things as gingerly or a ginger something. It either means to do something quiet without being noticed, or to be very intense and to grab attention, which is why we call a redhead a ginger, because their hair is grabbing attention. But we also say, you need to, walk gingerly, like meaning be quiet and soft and don't cause any problems, right? You think, well, what word is it that somehow split into meaning those two opposite things? Well, it didn't. Two words came into English from two different languages that happened to sound very similar, and we merged their spelling. But their etymology is totally separate. Another, and this sometimes it does work that way. An example is the word screen. Screen means either like, the screen that you're looking at that shows you things, right? A television screen or a computer or a phone screen. Or it means a block, something that keeps things out. Like a screen could be a wall, or it could be something that filters, like say it keeps bugs from getting in. And you say, these are opposite. Screen can either mean something that shows you information or something that blocks something. Well, do they come from two different things? Well, no, actually they don't. The original meaning of screen is to block something, to block. Well, when movie projectors became a thing, they had to project it. They projected the movie on something, or before movies, it was just pictures. They had to project it on something solid that blocked light. So they projected it onto a screen, like as in just a solid, opaque surface, right? And so, and slowly the screen changed from something you're projecting onto and has to just block the light into something that's actually projecting out, right? And so now we have screen meaning two opposite things, but it comes from, it's actually a super common Northern and Western European word. You find it in Old French and German and Norse and lots, like it's either skren or ekren or something like that, which just means to block. It can be like to block the sun, to give you shade, or in I think it's some Gaelic language, some Celtic language, it means like a scarf to block the cold. It's like kind of like a coat that you wear to block the cold, right? So the word, the history of it just means to block. But because of projectors and movies, it has also come to mean to show, right? Yeah. Like if you say, well, we're having a screening, well, that means you're showing a movie, which is the opposite of blocking, right? So the practice of etymology is don't just, like sometimes it's cool to look at a word and say, I bet it comes from over here, from this other word. But don't assume, because sometimes it will be crazy, crazy different from what you think, right?
Right.
So that's a very, very interesting process. Generally speaking, it's okay to look at a word and say, I think it comes from here. But unless you have a lot of experience with it, look it up. Type in, where does the word screen come from, right? And with a little research, you can find out where it is, where it comes from. Yeah. But it can be a lot of fun. I love the history of words.
Now, you mentioned Gaelic and Celtic roots, and that ties in with Jack's next question, which is, are there any words in English from Celtic roots? Most words, especially in modern science, are Greco-Latin. Did they leave a system of writing? So this is the Celts. Yeah, so it is true. Like we think of most of our words coming from
Greco-Latin. Actually,
Latin, and then some French, which I guess kind of ties in with the Latin.
Remember, the two languages that are have most influence on English are Germanic languages and French, right? French is just an evolution of Latin. Like French, modern French just comes from Latin, which comes from Greek, right? But don't forget the whole Germanic side of things. English is very heavily influenced by Saxon, which is German, Anglo, which is German Danish, and also by Norse and Icelandic, right? Those are the two biggest influences, but they're not the only ones. Before before the German tribes and the Scandinavian groups came into modern day Great Britain, it was all Gaelic. Now, originally Celtic or Gaelic did not have their own written language, but when the Romans came, everyone started writing things with the Roman alphabet. They had runes before that, which are similar, but then everyone started writing with the Latin alphabet. We talk about this a little bit in our video about the ash symbol and the ash, the sound. So that said, there are a ton of words that come from that are still in English that existed before the French conquest, for example. Queen is an example. But if you go even older to actual Celtic words, yes, there are some. There's an old rule of thumb that if there's two words for something in English, two really common, really simple words, one probably came from French and one came from Norwegian or German of some sort. Like for a pig, there's pig and there's pork, the kind of meat. Pork comes from French, pig comes from German or Scandinavian, I'm not sure. So that rule, you can add it. If there's three words for something, maybe the third came from a Celtic language. So there's pig, there's pork, and there's hog. Hog comes from a Gaelic language. I'm not sure which. They were all kind of mixed together back then. So hog is one. Another is like doe, like a female deer. And there are others. There are others. A crag or a tor. Those are both words for a mountain, right? And those come from, I think, Welsh or something, like lots of mountains, right? And so there are a few others. There's a few others. I think the word brat, like a bratty kid, comes from Gaelic. It means like a beggar, I think, or something like that. I can't remember, but I'm pretty sure the word brat does. So Celtic words sometimes are the most earthy. A hog, a doe, a tor, a brat. I don't know. They have a certain. They're kind of fun. But they're not as common as words that come from French and therefore from Latin. But don't forget words that come from Norwegian, some Scandinavian, or some German language, which are also very, very common. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so thanks for that, Jack. So moving on now, I'm going to read this question from Zahira on Facebook first of all, and then I'll put it up on the screen because it's very long. I'm not sure it's all going to fit. So if I put it up first, I won't be able to read it. So Zahira says, "Hi, I hope you're doing great, and I first want to congratulate you for the great job you're doing. Thank you very much. My question is, assuming that no conditions are certain to be met, yet the condition that describes a truth or fact is most intriguing, how come that a description of a scientific truth that describe a fact can be hypothetical? Conditional type 0 clearly states that, e.g., if you heat ice, it melts. Is there any other option to this? If no, why do we use the conditional then? Why don't we just certify that instead of putting the sentence in hypothetical state?"
So, yeah, wow, that is a very good question. So if you're basically asking, if you say if you heat ice, then it melts, why does that have to be a conditional, an if then? And the answer is it doesn't. You could say heated ice melts, right? Or ice melts when you heat it, right? And I think that second one really answers the question. Ice melts when you heat it, or when you heat ice, it melts, right? Sometimes a condition does not represent, is it true or not, but when it happens. Conditions aren't always about whether it's true, like universally. It says a condition for something is the trigger, like what causes it or when it happens, right? Like you could say the sun rises in the morning. Well, you could phrase that as if it's morning, the sun is rising, right? So conditions don't always represent a true or false, but they say when something happens or what causes it, right? Like, if I'm sad, I cry. Or when I'm sad, I cry. Or being sad makes me cry, right? You can either state it as a conditional or not as a conditional. But that doesn't mean it's hypothetical. That's the trigger. That's when it happens.
Yeah, it's interesting, the whole conditionals and the different types of conditionals. You mentioned the zero conditional. So there's the zero, the first conditional, second conditional. Is there third conditional? I think so. But then they get referred to by different names in different textbooks. It's one of these things where there's inconsistent grammatical terms to refer to the same thing. For sure. But yeah, though they are very interesting when you understand the different structures. Okay, so yeah, thank you for that question. But yeah, try to keep questions shorter. If you want to give us a compliment, if you want to give us a compliment like you did, that was very nice of you. Maybe put that as a separate comment because otherwise it's difficult to fit the whole question on the screen.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you very much for that. So let's see. There's a question here from Christian on back on YouTube, who says, "Hello, I'm an undergraduate student in English letters, and I live in Indonesia. Do you have any suggestions in developing my pronunciation to make a better comprehension in my conversation to natives?" Okay, so when you say you're a student in English letters, do you mean you're focusing on writing and spelling, or do you mean...
No, it's an English degree, right?
Right, yeah. So, so yeah, developing pronunciation, because I thought maybe you were referring to the IPA, which is...
So Christian actually has a follow-up to this in response to NTM said, "Oh, you should listen to podcasts or watch movies." And Christian says, "I have tried some popular ways in understanding English pronunciation, but I think the Indonesian cultural background has affected the local accent a lot, and it leads to English mispronunciation." First of all, very well stated, well spoken, Christian. Good job. I think.
Yeah, I mean that's a common thing. I mean, we had a question.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say we had that comment earlier on from the person in Hong Kong. I can't remember the name, and also we have a lot. Dave, yeah, and we have a lot of people from India, and these are all places where English is spoken a lot, but then there are these sort of mistakes that are kind of...
So how do you fight, like, if there's a common English accent where you live, how do you not just have that accent? That's a tough question. And the biggest thing, like, we want to remind you, I think NTM said, accent and correct pronunciation are two different things. We want to remind you of that. Accent and pronunciation are not the same thing. So don't worry too much about your accent. Focus on pronunciation. Right?
Yeah.
So we talked about this earlier in the live stream, right? Find out what sounds you're making wrong, right? Find someone, a native speaker, and ask them, tell me what sounds I'm saying wrong, if you can, right? Or someone who knows English better. Ask them which sounds you're making a mistake on, or that you're a little hard to understand. Then look up, that sound. For instance, watch Colin's great videos about each sound in English. Learn how to say it physically. Pronunciation is physical. And then practice that, right? So we've talked about that. But then how do you just generally go against if your entire culture has certain sounds they mispronounce, right, in English? And that can be tricky, right? That definitely is tricky. Just practice, like, learn how to say the correct pronunciation physically. Learn where to put your tongue, your teeth, your lips, what to do with your vocal cords and your breath. And then practice that like you're working out, right? Or like you're going to the gym and you're doing very specific exercises.
Yeah, I think that is what we've never really talked about it in this way before, but this way that there are mistakes that are kind of deeply ingrained in some people's way of speaking, because English is used a lot in their country as a second language, or even as a first language. And this is why they say they have an accent. They want to reduce their accent. This is where that sort of comes from. So yeah, it's interesting. But again, I think the same rule comes, is relevant. That English is, or pronunciation is physical, and if you want to improve it, you need to break it down into those different sounds, and figure out physically what it is that you're doing that you shouldn't, or not doing that you should, or that you're doing wrong. And that's where the IPA is really useful. So okay, thank you very much for that question.
Good question.
Let's see.
We've got a couple more questions that would be really nice to get to. I think Jack asks, is every word derived from is in a hierarchical sense? And no, it isn't. I've heard that before, but it really isn't true. Some words come from is, like become, right? Come to be.
Well, and also
out of be.
Yeah,
But,
I mean, be is the root word, right? Not is.
well, it depends. There like in different languages and stuff like. But the reality is, verbs usually come from nouns, and things like this. If you're talking about like where do we get the verb throw or something like that, right? That doesn't come from the verb be or is, even in some ancient Assyrian or something language. If you're categorizing verbs, then is at the top of the categories, but that doesn't mean that other verbs come from is or be, even in some other ancient language, right? Yeah. So again, it's tricky. Etymology is tricky, and especially because you can't learn etymology in just one language. That every word in any language we know comes from, it's either a relatively recent word or it comes from an older language, and so on, going back really far. Right.
Yeah.
Also, okay, Roman had a question.
Yeah, I was
just
going to say,
swine.
We are running out of time, so yeah, we got this quick question from Roman. Then we got Gabrielle, and
I think that's
one from Zahira at the end.
Oh, another one from Zahira. Okay.
Yeah. So we'll those are the questions. We'll answer those. We'll do those real quick, and but yeah, anything else we'll have to wait for next time. But remember that we do have the Discord group. Jack is very active there. He's often writing questions, and we're always going to try and do those questions first. Although this week it looked like you'd taken some of your questions down, but then you asked some of those same questions here in the chat today. But yes, if you do have any questions, please do look at the Discord. The link's in the description. There's a channel there where you can put your questions, and we'll start with those questions as people are arriving in the live stream.
That's usually what we do.
Yeah. Great. So Roman says swine. So I think this was to do with when we were talking about different words for pig.
Right. No. So swine comes from German. It comes into English through the Saxons. So it's like Schwein or something in German. So that's another. That one comes from German, like pig does, and then pork comes from French, but only hog, I think. Although sow. I think sow actually comes from the word swine, so that also comes from German. And I don't know off the top of my head where boar comes from, but yeah, there are a lot of words for pig. Pigs are apparently very important to the early English.
Yeah, and the modern English.
I guess. Maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we say it's a question from Gabrielle.
Right.
When do you double the verb to be, like in you are being fidgety rather than you're fidgety? Does it relate to a temporary condition?
So remember that doubling the verb, you're actually using the present continuous form of be, right? I am being, you are being. Right? That's the present continuous. So the answer is it's the same as when you would use the present simple or the present continuous. Like you are. So yes, in this case, you're being fidgety. You're emphasizing that you're talking about right now, starting a little bit ago, and you haven't stopped yet. Right? Though you could say, well, you're fidgety, and you mean the same thing. But when you say you're being fidgety, you're emphasizing that you're talking about right now. When you say you're fidgety, you could mean they're just a fidgety person in general, but not usually. Yeah.
The key here is that you are being fidgety is the present continuous. Tense,
exactly.
Whereas you are fidgety is the present simple tense. And when we use a continuous tense, we use the first be. So in this case, are, because it's you are. That is an auxiliary verb. So its meaning is not. We're using it for grammatical structure rather than for its actual meaning.
Yes.
Right. Whereas but then it just so happens that the main verb is also to be, but this time in the continuous form or the ing form, being. So that's why we're doubling it there. But the first one, like I said, is an auxiliary verb.
Auxiliary.
It's not really the verb like with its meaning. It's more for grammatical structural purposes.
The same thing happens with the verb have if you're using the present perfect of it. You say I have had a good time. Well, you're just saying, I have a good time. I had a good time, but in the perfect tense. So the first have is just the auxiliary verb. So I have had a great time in this live stream. Right?
Yeah, and so one way it can get confusing is if you're saying a perfect tense in the past perfect, you can say he had a good time. Then you got the verb have in the same form twice in a row, but it's still correct.
Correct. Yeah, it is still correct because the first one is an auxiliary verb, not the main verb.
Yeah. So that's another one of the rules, or one of our big ideas in our course, Inside English, where we talk about the importance of auxiliary verbs in forming tenses. It's actually much more important than the form of the verb. The main verb is the auxiliary verbs, and this is something that I think is different in a lot of other languages. So people doesn't often.
Yeah, but it's something to really focus on in English.
Yeah,
because it really, really makes the English tense. It's all about the auxiliary verb. Yeah. So focus on that. Yeah.
Great. Okay. And then I think the last question
that we have time for.
Yeah.
It was on Facebook, right, Zahira?
Oh yeah. Yes. So here we are.
Does when to replace if have the same meaning as whenever? Okay, so yeah, exactly. I say, when you heat water or when you heat ice, it melts. Could you say whenever you heat water, it melts? Whenever focuses on the fact that this is not a specific event, that anytime this happens, that this is going to be the result. So they're very similar. They can have different meanings, but yes, in the context of what you're talking about, like something that we know is true, right? We're not going to say, well, if, like, it's not, imagine if you ever heated ice. Well, no, we heat ice all the time, right? Or, well, we don't usually do it on purpose, but ice heats all the time, right? So it's not a hypothetical so much as it is a trigger. That's the kind of conditional. Like we know when it happens because this other thing happens, right? And so then you could say when or whenever in those situations. Yes, exactly, right? With any kind of scientific fact, whenever you drop something, it falls, is the same as if you drop something, it falls.
Yeah.
Because it's true whenever that condition happens, but all the time that condition happens, not just certain times, right? Yeah. Good example.
Great. Okay, well, there are a few more questions have come in, but unfortunately, we have run out of time. But remember, head on over to Discord, put them in the channel questions for the live stream.
And Jack, please go ahead, ask your questions in the Discord channel. But everyone else,
because we did notice that we were ready. I think last week as well, was it? We had your. Oh no, yeah. Last week we saw some questions, but then we didn't get round to them. But I think what we're definitely going to prioritize the questions from Discord.
So put your questions in the Discord.
This week, Jack, we did notice that the questions that we were going to start with, they'd all suddenly disappeared. So yeah, you're not being obnoxious. That's exactly what we want people to do.
For sure.
Although so far it's still people are still kind of we're still finding our feet with the Discord. But Jack has been great.
NTM, you have your question. So just go I think it's the bottom link in the description is the link to the Discord. Just go on there, sign up, join the channel, and then the one that is for questions for the live stream. Just put your question in there, and we can start with it next week, maybe.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, thank you for watching, and hopefully we will see you all again next week. But yeah, check out Discord, check out the website. Make sure you join the mailing list. We're also on Facebook. So yeah, have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.